It was the autumn of 1894. In the rugged hills of Newton County, Arkansas, the rain just wouldn't stop. It wasn't a gentle spring shower. No, this was a hard, relentless rain that turned dusty farm roads into rivers of thick, red mud, the kind of mud that could swallow a wagon wheel whole. For the farmers and families living in these isolated parts, the weather was everything. It dictated when you planted, when you harvested, and when you could even think about making the long, difficult journey into the nearest town for supplies. The Benton family, like their neighbors, found themselves trapped by the downpour. John Benton, his wife Margaret, and their 4 children, young John Jr., sweet Mary, and the 2 little ones Samuel and Rose, were used to a quiet life. Their farm was their whole world. It was a small but tidy piece of land, nestled in a hollow surrounded by dense woods. But this autumn felt different. The constant drumming of rain on the tin roof of their modest farmhouse became the only sound they heard for weeks on end. It kept them close to their hearth, gathered together for warmth and company. They couldn't work the fields. They couldn't visit friends. They were simply waiting for the sky to clear. The children probably grew restless, their energy contained within the 4 walls of the house. Margaret likely spent her days mending clothes, preparing what food they had stored and trying to keep their spirits up. John would have stared out the window often, watching the gray sheets of rain, worrying about his crops and his livestock. The isolation was a normal part of life here, but the unending wet weather made it feel heavier, more complete. It was a forced quiet, a long, drawn-out pause in the rhythm of their lives, holding them in place as the world outside turned to soup. So they waited. They read from the family Bible, they told stories, they lived in their own small bubble, cut off from everyone. No one thought it was strange. When the weather was this bad, you stayed put. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the only thing to do. The Benton family was home, safe and sound, waiting for the sun to return. Or so everyone believed. It was the last time anyone could say for certain where the Bentons were. The rain kept their secret for a little while longer, washing away any hint of what was to come. November finally arrived, and with it, a change. The heavy clouds began to break apart like a thinning blanket. Patches of blue sky appeared, and then a weak but welcome sun. The relentless rain slowed to a drizzle and then stopped altogether. The land began to dry. The thick, impassable mud slowly hardened, and the roads once again became bumpy tracks instead of flowing streams. For the scattered families of Newton County, it was a great relief. It was time to get back to life. It was time to go to town. Wagons, once stuck in the mud, started to roll again. Neighbors who hadn't seen each other in weeks met on the road, tipping their hats and exchanging news. The general store in the nearby town of Jasper started to bustle with activity. Farmers came in for flour, sugar, and salt. They came for nails and tools. But more than that, they came for connection, to see familiar faces and catch up on all the local gossip after being isolated for so long. Everyone, it seemed, had a story to tell about how they survived the great rains of 1894. But as the days passed, a question began to form. It was a quiet question at first, spoken in low tones between friends. Has anyone seen the Bentons? John Benton was a man people noticed. He was quiet, but he was reliable. He always came to town for supplies after a long spell of bad weather. Margaret, too, was a familiar face, often chatting with other mothers while their husbands conducted business. Yet, their wagon hadn't been seen. Their familiar faces were missing from the crowds. At first, no one was too worried. Perhaps their part of the road was still too muddy. Maybe one of the children was sick and they were waiting another day or two. There were 100 simple explanations, but then a week passed, and then another. The concern grew from a quiet whisper to a louder, more urgent question. Why hadn't anyone heard from the Bentons? It just wasn't like them to be gone for so long. Something felt wrong. The absence of the Benton family was becoming a silence that was too loud to ignore. The person who worried the most was Virgil Kemp. He was the Benton's closest neighbor, though close in these parts meant his farm was still a good mile away through the woods. He and John Benton had an arrangement. They helped each other during harvest and looked out for one another's property. Virgil knew John's habits. He knew that John would have been eager to check on his livestock and get to town as soon as the roads were clear. The fact that he hadn't was more than just strange, it was alarming. The silence from the Benton farm was starting to feel heavy, like a storm cloud that refused to move. Finally, Virgil couldn't stand the waiting and wondering any longer. He told his wife he was going to walk over and check on them. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind that usually felt full of promise. But as Virgil made his way along the familiar path to the Benton place, a feeling of unease settled over him. The woods were too quiet. He didn't hear the usual sounds of a working farm. No rooster crowing, no cow lowing, no children laughing or shouting in the yard. The only sound was the crunch of his own boots on the damp leaves. As he stepped out of the woods and into the clearing where the farmhouse stood, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The house was just still, deathly still. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Chickens were scratching around the yard, but they looked thin, unfed. A cow in the small barn was making a low, unhappy sound. It was clear the animals hadn't been tended to in days. Virgil's heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't a family who had gone on a trip. This was a family that had vanished. He called out, "John! Margaret!" His voice echoed in the strange quiet, but there was no answer. He walked up to the porch, his steps loud on the wooden planks. He pushed the door open wider and peered inside. The house was dark and cold. The silence inside was even deeper than the silence outside. It was the kind of silence that feels empty, a place where life used to be but wasn't anymore. Virgil Kemp knew, right then and there, that something terrible had happened. He backed away slowly, turned, and ran back toward his own farm as fast as he could. He had to get the sheriff. Virgil Kemp didn't waste a moment. He saddled his fastest horse and rode hard for the town of Jasper, the county seat. The story he told Sheriff Dawson was hurried and filled with a sense of dread. An empty farm, a door swinging open, animals left to starve. The sheriff, a practical man who had seen his share of trouble in the Ozark Hills, listened carefully. He gathered a small group of men, a posse of sorts, and they rode out toward the Benton farm. They knew they might be walking into a scene of sickness, or worse, violence. The ride was tense, with few words spoken among the men. When they arrived, the scene was exactly as Virgil had described. It was a picture of life interrupted. The sheriff and his men moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every detail. The first thing they noticed was the barn. The poor cow was weak from hunger and thirst. The chickens scattered wildly. It was obvious these animals had been neglected for at least a week, maybe longer. This wasn't a planned departure. No farmer, especially not a responsible one like John Benton, would ever just walk away and leave his livestock to suffer and die. The men exchanged worried glances. This was already looking bad. Inside the house, the mystery only deepened. It was as if the Benton family had simply evaporated into thin air. In the kitchen, the dining table was set for supper. Plates, cups, and silverware were all in place. A pot of stew, now cold and spoiled, sat on the wood-burning stove. Half-eaten biscuits were still on the plates. It looked like the family had been about to sit down for their evening meal when... What? Something had called them away so suddenly that they left their food untouched. The fire in the hearth was long dead, nothing but cold, gray ash. The men moved through the small house. In the main room, clothes were laid out on a bed, as if someone was preparing to mend them. A child's doll lay on the floor in the middle of the room, dropped and forgotten. Everything was neat, tidy, and in its place, except for the family that was supposed to be there. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no bloodstains, nothing to suggest a violent intrusion. It was just an empty house, filled with the ghosts of a normal evening that never finished. The silence was unnerving. Where could 6 people go? Sheriff Dawson was a methodical man. He wasn't one to, jump to conclusions. He instructed his men to search the house from top to bottom. looking for anything that seemed out of place. They were to touch as little as possible. He wanted to read the story that the silent house was trying to tell him. Every room was the same. The beds were made. Clothes were folded neatly in drawers or hung on pegs on the wall. It was the home of a family that took pride in their life, no matter how simple it was. The eerie tidiness made their absence even more frightening. The sheriff paid close attention to the details. In the parents' bedroom, he found John Benton's rifle still hanging over the fireplace. In those days, a man living in the remote wilderness did not go anywhere without his rifle. It was for hunting and, more importantly, for protection. The fact that John had left it behind was a powerful clue. It suggested he either left in an extreme hurry, without a moment to think, or he didn't leave the farm by choice. Neither option was comforting. Why would a man leave his home and his family defenseless? But then they found something that seemed to offer an explanation. On the small table next to Margaret Benton's side of the bed there was a piece of paper. It was a note written in her familiar, neat handwriting. The sheriff picked it up carefully. The message was short and strange. It said, "There is trouble. We have gone to seek help. We will be back by morning." The note was not signed, and it was not dated. It was just those few cryptic words. Trouble. What kind of trouble could make an entire family flee into the night, leaving everything behind? The note raised more questions than it answered. If they had gone to seek help, where did they go? The nearest neighbor was Virgil Kemp, and they certainly hadn't gone there. The town was a long, hard journey, especially in the dark. And why hadn't they returned by morning, as the note promised? Several mornings had come and gone since they disappeared. The sheriff read the words over and over. There is trouble. It hung in the air, a chilling, incomplete sentence. The search had just begun, but the mystery was already twisting into something dark and complicated. With the strange note in hand, Sheriff Dawson expanded the search. He and his men fanned out, walking in careful lines across the farm's property. They checked the barn again, the chicken coop, the small tool shed. They found nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. The recent rains had washed the ground clean, leaving behind only mud and fallen leaves. It was as if the earth itself was helping to keep the secret. The family had vanished without a trace, and the land offered no clues as to where they had gone. The sheriff then decided to organize a wider search of the surrounding woods. He knew it was a difficult task. The Ozark wilderness was vast, rugged, and unforgiving. A person could get lost just a few hundred yards from a familiar path. An entire family could disappear into its deep hollows and dense forests and never be seen again. For days, the sheriff and a growing group of volunteers combed the area. They shouted the Bentons' names until their voices were hoarse. The only reply was the echo of their own calls. As the search continued with no results, the sheriff began to think about the house again. There had to be something they missed. He returned to the silent farmhouse, this time looking not for what was there, but for what might be hidden. He tapped on the walls, listening for hollow sounds. He lifted the floorboards, peering into the dark space beneath the house. He was looking for a hiding place, a secret compartment, anything that could explain how 6 people could disappear from a locked-in, isolated farm. It was during this second, more desperate search that he found it. In the main room, hidden beneath a large, heavy rug, was a trapdoor. It was well made and fit snugly into the floor, almost invisible. The sheriff and his men pried it open. It revealed a steep, narrow set of stone steps leading down into the darkness. A wave of cold, musty air rose up to meet them. It was a root cellar, a common feature in farmhouses of that time. But as the sheriff held his lantern over the opening, he saw that this was no ordinary cellar. This was something else entirely. While the sheriff focused on the physical evidence, or lack thereof, stories began to spread among the neighbors. People who lived miles away from the Benton farm started to remember things they had seen or heard in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. In a community gripped by fear and confusion, every strange memory suddenly seemed like a piece of the puzzle. These were not official witness statements given to the sheriff, but whispers shared over fences and around dinner tables. They painted a picture of a family that may have been in trouble long before they vanished. One neighbor, a woman named Martha Clark, told her husband that she had heard strange noises coming from the direction of the Benton farm a few weeks back. It was late at night during the worst of the rains. She said it sounded like chanting, a low, rhythmic sound that was carried on the wind. At the time, she dismissed it as the wind itself or maybe the cry of an animal. But now, she wasn't so sure. She said it was an unnatural sound, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. The story spread quickly, adding a layer of folk horror to the mystery. Another farmer who lived on the other side of the hollow remembered seeing strange lights in the woods near the Benton property. He was checking on his animals during a break in the rain when he saw them, flickering lights like lanterns moving deep within the trees. He assumed it was hunters even though it was an odd time to be out. But there were no gunshots and the lights moved in a strange, almost ceremonial pattern before disappearing. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now the memory felt sinister, connected to the family's fate. Even Virgil Kemp, the man who first raised the alarm, recalled something odd. He said that in the month before they disappeared, John Benton had become withdrawn and quiet. He seemed worried, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he were being watched. Virgil had asked him if everything was all right, but John had just shaken his head and said it was family business. At the time, Virgil respected his friend's privacy. Now, he wondered what secret family business could lead to such a terrifying end. These stories, whether true or imagined, created a legend around the disappearance. Holding his lantern high, Sheriff Dawson descended the stone steps into the darkness beneath the Benton farmhouse. The air grew colder and damper with each step. The small root cellar was at the bottom, just as he expected. It was a small, stone-lined room, cool and dry, with shelves for storing potatoes, apples, and jars of preserved food. But the sheriff's eyes were drawn to the far wall. There, he saw what made this cellar different. A low, narrow opening was carved into the stone and earth, the entrance to a tunnel. It was just big enough for a person to crawl through. The sheriff, a brave and determined man, got down on his hands and knees and entered the passage. It was tight and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something old and unpleasant. The tunnel was not long, maybe only 20 or 30 feet. It twisted slightly and then opened into another, larger space. As the sheriff stood up and raised his lantern, his breath caught in his throat. He was standing in a natural limestone cave. The walls glittered with moisture, and the air was heavy and still. It was clear the Bentons knew about this cave and had connected it to their home. He explored the cave carefully. It was not a single large chamber, but a network of smaller passages and rooms that went deeper into the hillside. In one of the chambers, he found signs that people had been there recently. There were a few empty blankets, a small spent campfire, and some scattered food wrappers. It seemed the family might have used this cave as a hiding place. Perhaps this is where they went when trouble came. But the cave was as empty as the house above. There was no family here. There were no bodies. The sheriff and his men searched the cave system for hours, following every passage until it became too narrow or ended in a wall of rock. They found nothing more. The trail went cold in the deep, silent darkness of the earth. With no other clues and no sign of the family, the official search was eventually called off. The sheriff had reached a dead end, both literally and figuratively. The mystery of the Benton family was complete. They had vanished from their home, leaving behind a half-eaten meal, a cryptic note, and a secret passage to an empty cave. Years passed. The seasons changed. The Benton farm stood abandoned, a silent monument to its missing family. The house slowly began to decay. The roof sagged. The windows broke. Weeds and vines grew up the walls, pulling at the wooden planks. The fields that John Benton had once worked so hard to cultivate were reclaimed by the wilderness. Wild grasses and young trees grew where corn and beans once stood. The farm became a place that local people avoided. It was considered haunted, a place of deep sorrow and unanswered questions. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the decaying porch. Eventually, the county took possession of the land. Because the Bentons were never declared legally dead, they were simply missing. The property existed in a strange legal limbo for a long time. It was eventually sold at auction for a very low price. A new family bought it, hoping to start a new life. They were brave people, not scared by the stories. They tore down what was left of the old Benton house, wanting to erase the sad history and build fresh. They filled in the root cellar and the entrance to the cave, sealing the secret passage forever. But you cannot erase a story so easily. Even with a new house and a new family on the land, the legend of the Bentons lived on. The story was passed down from generation to generation in Newton County. It became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. The details changed with each telling. Some said the family was taken by spirits of the woods. Others believed they stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see and were silenced. Some even whispered they simply used the cave to escape a dark secret and start a new life somewhere else. To this day, the disappearance of the Benton family remains one of Arkansas's greatest unsolved mysteries. No bodies were ever found. No one ever came forward with a credible explanation. All that is left is the story, a story of a normal family, a sudden interruption, and a silence that has now lasted for over a century. The rain-soaked autumn of 1894 holds its secrets tightly, and somewhere in the hills of Newton County, the quiet farm continues to ask its silent, haunting question. What happened to the Bentons? A question for which there may never be an answer.